Welcome back to the Talent Talk Radio Show. If you're just joining us, you missed a great interview with Sean Herman, the CHRO of Service King Collision Repair Centers. But you can listen to the entirety of his interview and catch this one again if you need to on iTunes on the podcast app, or you can listen to us on iHeartRadio once we publish that here in a few weeks. Just look for Talent Talk, all one word, on either one of those platforms. You can also go to talenttalkradio.com and find us there. All our shows are there, and happy to have you take a listen. My next guest here live in studio with me is Tim Silvera, the president and founder of Optimum Comp Advantage, Inc. Tim and I were both speakers at the Executive Next Practices Institute event at UC Irvine a couple months ago, and I knew we had to have him in on the show, so he's finally here. We're going to have a good conversation. As a reminder, don't forget to tweet your questions if you have one at PeopleG2 and use that hashtag Talent Talk. But Tim, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having us in today.
Yeah, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and your company, Optimum Comp Advantage?
Well, you know, I have over 25 years HR experience, mostly specializing in total reward practices. I worked in-house for most of that 25 years as a VP of HR or a VP of total rewards. About 4 years ago, I started a compensation consulting firm. After 6 months, I sold it to a much larger company. 2.5 years later, I bought it back. So in May, we started Optimum Comp Advantage. And basically, we specialize in innovative compensation and performance practices that engage today's workforce. We have worked with over about 70 companies since we founded since I started consulting about 4 years ago, and basically 30 to 40 different industries.
So I know that total rewards and workplace optimization often are things that some companies don't consider or they don't maybe even act upon. But yeah, you've had a long career working in this part of the HR space. So maybe what have you found to be the most important aspect of rewards as it pertains to creating a successful company culture?
You know, when we talk to companies now, it's really about helping them build a results-driven culture. And the two things that are most important are actually having effective reward practices that are integrated with performance practices. And those practices need to be integrated and customized for each business group, not just, one size fits all. The second thing is companies that spend the time to understand and develop the metrics for each group independently for their company and integrate those metrics with special reward practices actually are always successful. So we find those two things to be the most two important things.
Well, I imagine that people naturally know how to do that for sales, or they think about doing that for sales teams, right? But then how do you do that for customer service? And how do you do that for accounting and all these other departments? So do you find that that's a challenge for them?
When I first started the consulting firm, we were talking to one client, and he was looking at some of the work that I had done, and he looked at me and goes, "Tim, what you're doing is designing programs like you do for sales forces, specifically for their organization." And I said, "You're exactly right. We actually go in, and it's not really, for most groups, it's really not that hard. Go into customer service organizations. In fact, I worked for a customer service organization that had 60,000 call center agents, and we designed the performance management and reward practices specifically to each client. It was an outsourcing company. For each client, we designed the reward practices and performance practices for each group inside that company. So it's really just getting in and understanding the metrics that drive the performance of each group and then reinforcing that with rewards. It sounds simple, but there's a lot of work that goes into it.
Sure. Well, I know a few weeks ago when I saw you speak, I kind of learned a little bit more about the optimum reward strategy. Maybe what's different about your approach to compensation and performance practices?
Well, when you look at it, when we talk about our optimum reward strategy, it was specifically designed to motivate today's workforce. It actually starts with a career track job structure. Employees want to understand, what is my career opportunity and career progression within the company, and also related to promotional opportunities. The second piece of the strategy is really creating custom incentive plans that reward employees for not only company performance, but how does their individual results impact their payouts, those types of things. And the last piece is building performance optimization tools that reward employees for their individual success in value to your company.
Well, maybe go a little bit deeper about what performance optimization is.
Well, performance optimization, I started using the term performance optimization almost 10 years ago now. And it was because performance management has so many bad traditional connotations and overused and
Sounds like micromanaging a little bit, and
that kind of stuff, right? So I came up with this term. I go, well, let's talk about what do we really do when we design performance practices. We're helping the organization optimize its performance. That's how I coined the phrase performance optimization. And so it basically replaces traditional performance management. But what really is going on and why it's really important today is today's workforce, millennials specifically, don't want to be managed. In fact, no workforce ever really wanted to be managed. They wanted to be engaged. They want collaboration. They want to work with everyone. So the performance optimization tools we actually create focus on how do you build employee-manager collaboration and create a real-time, this is what's really important, how do you create a real-time performance interaction between the managers and employees? I remember years ago they started doing let's do performance reviews every quarter. And all that did was clog up the HR work and slow everything down. What really has to happen is that managers need to be engaged in the work with the employee on a daily basis, coaching and sponsoring what that employee is trying to accomplish. So the last thing about performance optimization, it really is about real-time process that focuses on the goals and metrics that you're trying to accomplish in real time, and also the behaviors that really drive your business results and performance as an organization.
So what are some of those tools that you're using then for, that type of optimization?
So, a lot of times your performance reviews, the old traditional one is designed to treat everybody the same. And so what we really get in place is designing real-time performance processes that measure the results and impact on business. So as you know, sales, it was pretty easy, sales and other metrics that supported that sales process, revenue, net income, all those types of metrics, pretty easy on the sales side. But when you look at customer service, client services, client relations, R&D, you have to really dig in. And what are the key metrics that really state that they're performing at a high level and impacting business results? So you do that, and then you develop that piece. The other thing with performance optimization is actually the incentive plan. How do you really get the measurements down where people know the alignment between what they're doing and the results of the organization? And it's usually metric driven. So most companies, for about 50 to 60, 70% of the organization, you can find true metrics that reinforce the success of the business. Even when you look at HR, a hiring time, length of service after being hired, performance of those employees. It's not just, hiring ratios and, filling seats, but it's really what is the results of the employees that they've been hiring. So you can find the metrics, but you have to really find the metrics that lead to performance. I was at an organization one time, and the head of HR that I worked for, he only wanted to be accountable for doing the customer employee satisfaction survey. And I told him, well, the real metric is how we improve employee satisfaction in the company, not just doing the survey. And so it's really getting to the metrics and improvement at the metrics that you believe impact the short and long-term success of a company.
So, if a company is looking at this and saying, well, okay, maybe I want to think about doing some of these things, why do companies then, why should they really be thinking about making this change to really, whether it's implement what you're talking about or something around compensation and performance? What's the why?
It's kind of interesting because people ask me this all the time, and it's really they have to have an impetus. If you're a company that's making money hand over fist, and you're not having trouble retaining people, and everybody's performing really well, and the company's growing at leaps and bounds, there's not a lot of reason to change things. So companies have to really have an impetus. So I work for a number of employers. In fact, we've worked for them for 3 years now that have 60, 70% millennials. And they have 60%, 30, 40, 50% turnover, people leaving after 8 months. So that's an impetus to really go in and figure out what are the types of programs you need to have in place to retain people longer than 18 months. And when you look at the turnover, the cost of an employee, replacing an employee, could be up to 18 months of that employee's salary. So when you're looking at that, it's a huge amount of money. We had a client that actually their impetus was high turnover millennials. And the CFO was involved in hiring us with the VP of HR. and one of the things was reducing turnover to increase productivity. And he actually created a model that actually showed that over a 2-year period, they saved $10 million 2 years in a row based on reducing their turnover based on productivity and output of the company. And he associated with how the compensation and career track job structures were designed that help people stay in the organization.
That's amazing. And, you know, sometimes we can show people direct costs, direct savings, and then there's the softer stuff, right? But if you can show savings in either factor, whether you get to 10 million somehow, I mean, that's pretty great.
Right. Yeah, it was kind of interesting. The CFO was involved, and I've always said it's really real money, and people say, "Oh, it's just soft money," and I've always said, "No, it's real money." And the CFO was really sharp because he created a model based on soft and hard numbers that showed this was a pure cost savings to the organization, including what the gains in the organization was based on not having such high turnover.
Right. Well, what are some of the key components then of having a good rewards program and being able to engage your employees?
Well, it starts with actually starting with a pay for success or pay for results compensation philosophy. A lot of companies have been saying for years, pay for performance. Well, as we know, a lot of CEOs lose their job and get paid for performance, like a lot of money for bad performance. So it's really creating a language around what you're doing with your compensation practices. So I would say create a philosophy that's meaningful, and then strategies of what you're trying to accomplish. And then I would tell you the foundation of any compensation program, of any successful HR organization, is building a career track job structure. So so the employees see a clear progression of moving from one job to the next, or seeing another career track within the organization, so I could cross-functional move into another organization and get cross-functional experience. And that really helps you retain your people, because if you don't have a career progression for people, they'll go find it somewhere else. And you can't just say, work real hard and I'll get you promoted. You really have to show people what they're working toward. The other piece is real-time compensation and performance practices that reward employees for their value and success. And when I'm talking about, stop doing the annual merit increase program, because not everybody should be rewarded exactly at the same time every year. Especially with the millennial generation, people are going to excel really fast. You need to reward them. You need to promote them. You might have incentive plans that are quarterly for some employees, semi-annually for others, annual for other employees. So you really got to make it more dynamic for your workforce. And then you have to actually have, back to the custom incentive plans, that really articulate how each employee's performance impacts the success of the business, and how do you actually drive the overall performance of the company.
You know, there's a whole lot there, and I'm wondering if, you know, how did you even get into all of this? Like, what was kind of the starting point for you to kind of really start to tackle some of these issues?
Well, it was really, there was two things. This was 30 years ago. I read a book called Using Compensation and Performance Practices as a Competitive Weapon. And boy, that was just a shock in the HR world 30 years ago.
Right.
The book wasn't successful, but I read it and I go, wow, this is earth-shattering. This is really cool stuff. About 10 years after that, I read a book called Innovative Reward Practices for a Rapidly Changing Workforce. That was in the 90s. So, I mean, rapidly changing, that's really happening over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, right? So it's just reoccurring. So those two books really are the foundation of innovation, and how do you really build compensation and performance practices and integrate them, because they all both talk about how you integrate them to drive business results. That's how I just got passionate about it from those two books.
And would those be the books you might suggest people read, or is there another book you've read recently you might suggest?
You can't even find those books anymore.
Okay, well, I don't know. Google Books might have it. They got everything, but
you can find the second edition of the second one, which isn't as good as the first edition. But the book I'm reading today is actually it's Managing the Millennials. Okay. I forget the author, but you can find it. It's a recent book. And what it really is, it's a really cool book, because it really is a guide to understanding the competencies for managing today's workforce. And what I really liked about the book is it starts by stating that the generational gap is only in our head, okay? And that every generation, every employee wants fulfillment, recognition, appreciation, and compensation for doing a great job. So when you have that frame, there's a lot of things different about the millennial generation. One of them is that it's a large generation, so 92 million strong, and so their preferences matter. So you really need to understand how to manage them, how to compensate them, how to reward them. And they don't want traditional comp practices. You can't hire them low. In fact, as we know, in California, we can't, after the first year, can't ask them what they previously made. So we have to pay them competitively, and that's a big component of it. But they don't want the 2 to 3% merit increase every year. They want to be paid for their value. And if they believe that you're not paying them for their value, they'll go find it somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah. And there's definitely some intricacies there with the Millennial group. I agree with you that overall the differences are not really what we think they are. They're just the differences in a different generation. But there certainly are some other interesting factors with the change in technology and their kind of really being able to access that in a different way. I love some of the funny stories though too, like you pick up a traditional phone and wonder what that tone is coming out of the other end, right?
Right.
What am I supposed to do with that? Yeah, I mean, I've had my kid, pick up the phone the other day. Well, why does it have this noise? Do I have to we have to dial 1 first?
So one of the myths is about the Saturday Night Live skit about the young woman coming in and she's on the job 2 days and she asks, when do I get promoted?
Right.
Well, that actually happened to me like 20 times. I had 20 different people I hired. How do I get promoted? But again, if you have a career track job structure, like I've always had this for many years, you show here's step 1, 2, and 3, and this is how you get there. And they love that.
I've often challenged HR groups to start saying yes to every question. And that first question I get from them is, but what if they ask for a raise? And they go, well, so you should say yes. And then you should tell them, yes, but here's how you get there. Or yes, and here's how you earn it. Here's the path. And I said, wouldn't that be great if everyone knew what the path was to get promoted or to get the raise or to get what they want? That it wasn't some deep, dark secret that only some guy in some ivory tower knew. And it would eliminate all that frustration, right?
Right, and that's what most of my compensation practices are built on. Make sure that everybody knows how their incentive plan works. Make sure everybody knows how they impact the success. Make sure everybody knows how they can get a promotion, how they can get a pay raise. And it's based on competitive practices, not some artificially created merit increase structure.
Right, right. Or just because you happen to be friends with that manager, right? Or friendlier with HR or whatever that may be.
Right.
Do you ever have the issue or have to kind of combat people who are trying to game your system at all, that are trying to maybe reach those certain categories without really doing the work that you intended for those?
You always have that, right, Chris? I mean, you look at, but if you put all the rules out on the table and then you teach managers how to use them effectively, then it's easier. You have less gaming because everything's out on the table.
Right.
When you game systems is when you don't know all the rules and you're playing around the fringe and pushing this way and that way. Or how do I get my employee an equity adjustment? There's no rules around an equity adjustment. So it's who has the most, who's favorite. Back to your thing, who's friendliest with HR gets more equity adjustments than the departments that aren't. Right.
Right.
So if you have all the rules out there, then you teach them how to play with the rules. Then people play within the rules. So you don't have, it's actually making what's the word? Transparency. So if things are transparent, people use it effectively, and the outcome is driving business performance, not gaming and playing games inside the company.
Now, do you find that you lose some people, and maybe that's a good thing, but are there other certain groups of people that don't want to live in that kind of transparent world as an employee?
We've seen with the millennial generation in our companies that, again, I mentioned we have 3 or 4 big companies that have 50-60% millennials. They are just outperforming their competition because everything is transparent. They, if they lose employees, they still have turnover. But if they're losing employees that don't want transparency and drive business performance, they're better off.
Right, right. And that's only going to get deeper, right, with the continuing aging out of other generations, and as you mentioned, that being such a large generation. Do you think this will, and this is obviously a Hail Mary question, but do you think the next generation that's coming up will be just as open to this type of management style?
Well, it's very similar, and I don't know a lot about the Z generation, but I saw a speaker that was talking about the X generation, and he said, okay, so you go back to the boomer generation was really large, but they were a silent generation, so their preferences they just kept silent on. The X generation was kind of small, right, comparatively, so they didn't get anything the way they wanted it.
Mm-hmm.
The millennials are 92 million. Well, the Z generation is small again, and the speaker said they're going to be so small their preferences won't matter. Focus on the millennial generation. For your lifetime, that'll be 92 million people,
Right.
and that's going to be the focus of what you're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, and that's a great way of putting it. And maybe there'll be some things, but they're certainly not going to have the weight
Right.
to bring to the table. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, you've mentioned a lot of great things here today. Maybe as a summary, could you kind of throw out a couple points of things you think people should have heard or written down or remembered if they were paying attention?
Two things. One is traditional compensation and performance practices just don't work. And the other one is companies need to design a set of optimum reward practices that give them a competitive edge in the marketplace. And they need to be designed and customized for each company because everybody has a different culture. And so you actually are creating what gives you a competitive edge. It's not adopting something that gave GE a competitive edge 30 years ago.
Well, it's definitely a good thing to think of. And as our markets change, what we're selling changes, and who we're hiring changes, I guess it's an important thing for us to think about going forward. So, how can people get a hold of you and learn more about what your company does if they're interested in doing something like this?
Yeah, my email address is tim.silvera, and the last name is spelled S-I-L-V as in Victor, E-R-A. And this is a long email address. It's optimumcompadvantage.com. We have a website, www.optimumcompadvantage.com.
Well, I'm sure they can find you. You're out there in cyberspace. So email, I'm sure LinkedIn, website, whatever it may be. Definitely check him out. But Tim, thanks so much for being a part of the show and coming in here to the studio and kind of getting us. I know I saw you speak at the EMP and really enjoyed what you had to say. So I'm glad you're able to kind of come in here and share with our listeners as well.
It was great. It was very enjoyable.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in here to the show. Hopefully you gained something that will help your own career in a positive way. Next week, my guest will be Jamie Gonzalez. I don't know if that's Jamie or is that Jaime, but we'll find out. The head of leadership and organizational development at JPL. I guess I better find out if it's JPL. So I think he was on our EMP thing. So
Yeah.
This is like a double EMP. And then Kim Sullivan, the CHRO for University of Texas Systems. All right. Until then, do what you love and show the world how talented you can be today.
You've been listening to Talent Talk Radio, brought to you by People G2.